we're very, very fortunate to have been able to work with York University and Heidi Fraser-Krauss over the last few months. And really what there's been is a convergence that we were interested in kind of costing models and tools, etc. In part because the first part of this project produced one of those. Some of you may have seen the Janet X-ray costing tool. And that was developed quite quickly really to meet a specific need of kind of benchmarking IT activities as a paid for product. And that's been used by a number of universities. And so what we're now doing is trying to kind of extend that into more open source materials that will be compatible with that Janet product, but obviously people can use without having to pay for it. We thought we were doing that kind of alone, as it were, but we then discovered that Heidi and her York team had already done quite a lot of work in that area. And so we've been fortunate enough to draw on that, and we'll then try and produce a kind of distillation over the next month or two in terms of an open source tool that you can actually utilise. So without further ado, over to Heidi Fraser-Krauss, Director of IT at York University.
Okay, well I feel under a little bit of pressure now, in fact quite a lot of pressure. First of all, I've got to give you a good presentation because that was one of the things they said, there's lots of good presentations. And secondly, not to be wanted by Interpol, so to be happy to be filmed. So I can definitely deliver on the not wanted by Interpol. Let's see if I can deliver on the presentation. Okay, so IT costs. Why would you want to find out about these things and what does that involve? So what I'm going to talk you through is the sort of work that we've been doing at the University of York. I'm not going to talk for an hour, but I'm hoping that at the end of my presentation we can have discussion. Very happy to answer your questions if I can answer them. Do my best. Okay, so why? I mean, Peter's talked about this a little bit already and I think covered a number of the points. I came into York 2 years ago as the IT director, and the first reason for me wanting to know about IT costs was, where is all this money in my budget actually going? You know, what is it being spent on? Because we had quite a lot of budget and I just wasn't sure what the relative proportions of costs were. Now, obviously staff costs are a big one, but what else? I mean, I looked at all these invoices that were going through and all sorts and thought, good Lord, that's a lot of money. So the first thing I wanted to do was understand where money was spent. The second thing I wanted to be able to do was to compare costs that we had with other providers. York had recently gone to Google for its email, calendaring, collaboration services. So it had taken a big step out into the cloud, and the university was keen to pursue that with other areas. But is it a good idea? Cost-wise? Is it cheaper to go out to the cloud? And until I knew what sort of costs we had internally, I cannot answer that question on the basis of cost. I could answer it on the basis of maybe improved service or whatever else, but I couldn't do it on cost. The other thing that we were doing is offering services to other people. So not just internal people, though we do have internal shared services, but we were also had been approached by an organisation that was then called the York Hull Public Health Observatory, and I think it's called Public Health England now, to help them host their services. How do I price that? I didn't know what it cost me to deliver the service. And as I wanted to we had recently built a new data centre, I want to sweat that asset, what can I sell it at? You know, I know what the commercials cost, but what's the relationship between cost and price? Do I want to undercut that, etc.? The other one, I suppose, is curiosity. You know, as I said at the beginning, where is all this money going? There's a lot of money. Where is it going? Obviously, I wanted to be able to argue for more resource. My budget's under pressure just like everybody else's. I can only argue for more resource when I know how much it's going to cost me to deliver more services or how much it costs me now, and to see whether I can compare that to somebody else and say, we're too expensive, we're too cheap, or whatever. And the other agenda item that I was set in York, and I'm assuming it's the same in other institutions, was I was set the task of looking at centralising provision. So York's a research-intensive institution. And, sorry, can I just ask for a show of hands? Who comes from an institution that would describe themselves as research-intensive? Right, okay, so quite a lot of you. So in research-intensive institutions, what tends to happen is that the big science departments in particular, any ones that have large amounts of money that they get in from other than central coffers, so research funding, for example, spend that money on developing their own services, their own suite of services. And that, you can argue both ways for it. The departments will say it's much better for me to have this resource locally because I have it under my control, but it's not a cost-effective way of doing it for commodity-type services. So again, I wanted to be able to understand how much it costs me as a central service provider to provide a service for, say, storage, compute, desktop or whatever, in comparison to how much it would cost a department. Now, obviously, the difficulty with that is the departments haven't been that keen to tell me how much it costs them. And I'm sure you can imagine why those reasons might be. But at least I can say I understand how much it costs me to do this and what service I'm providing. So those were some of the reasons why I started off on this piece of work. Any questions? Okay, when I first had the idea of doing this, it's very easy to say, an awful lot harder to do. And I think that when we started off on this project, I don't know about you, but I'm an optimist in terms of these things, and I tend to think, let's just get on with it and it will all be fine. But when we started to talk some more about how we would actually do this, it really did seem like a great big elephant to eat. And so we decided we would start somewhere, because how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? I mean, anybody who's doing this and starts to look at where do you start, it really is difficult to know where to start with this sort of piece of work. So how did we start? We started in a very pragmatic way. We started by saying, what do we do? What do we know that we do now? So we started by writing down all the types of services that we offer. And you'd say, well, haven't you got a service catalogue that says that? No, we don't. We have an outward-facing service catalogue, as in we know what we're offering to our customers, but there are lots and lots of things that we do internally that underpin the services that we offer, that we know we do them sort of, but we didn't have a big list of them. So we started by getting an on-the-ground understanding of the sorts of services that we did. We also looked at the assets we had. What have we actually got sitting in our data centres and in various places? And started to try and attribute the services that we knew we offered to the actual physical assets. And when I say physical assets here, we're highly virtualised in York, so it wasn't quite that simple, but let's say a virtualised asset. But we started to map X with Y. And one of the things that we discovered was that there were lots and lots of gaps. So we had bits of tin or servers. Good Lord, what does that do? And I don't know if those of you who work in IT, there is the experiment that you can take, you can switch it off and see if anybody notices approach. Depends how well used it is, but it is an interesting approach. But first lesson, we had loads of stuff, loads of pieces of kit, loads of services that we didn't know we were doing. We had pieces of kit that we didn't know what service they were doing, etc. And I'm sure, positive, if you do the same in your organisations, you'll find the same things. Next pragmatic step. We do know some things. We know how much we pay for license costs and maintenance costs. We didn't have all of those things in one place, but we did know that we spent this money. You know, we paid our Oracle license. We paid for our Red Hat licenses. We paid our SITS license costs, etc. So another pragmatic step was simply to gather all of those things in one place. I'm sorry, this all sounds very boring, but actually it was a very useful exercise. We discovered quite a lot of things that we didn't know. We discovered things that we were paying for we didn't need to pay for. Things that actually we should be paying for and hadn't been paying for. So it was quite an interesting exercise. We also looked at our hardware capital costs. That was a really interesting one, because some of our hardware is very old But we tried to find out how much our hardware had cost and over what period the university depreciated that over. And that was actually quite interesting. Central Finance didn't really have an answer for this one. You know, buildings, I don't know which organisations, in buildings you can go either way. You can have your 100-year depreciation for your old buildings, or you can have your 30-year depreciation for new buildings. But for IT equipment, there wasn't really an answer. 3 years, 5 years. So that was also an interesting exercise. Central Finance didn't really know what to do with IT assets. And some of them, for example, some of our network equipment, wiring, for example, you could depreciate over almost the life of a building, 20 years. Whereas networking kit, I don't know, you could push it out to your sort of 5 to 10 years. Some of the other things were less. So that was also an interesting exercise. We also worked out what did it cost us, so we're getting lower or higher up the stack depending on which way you look at it. We also then started to say, right, we know how much our VM license costs us, how much does it cost us to do a virtual machine? So working out these levels. We worked out storage costs. These are all underpinning services. We differentiated the tiers out. We run a NetApp, which is more expensive storage than our basic Sun Thumper or HP storage. And we then attributed these across the different services. So we said, for example, our virtual learning environment, we know how much the license costs, we know how much the hardware capital cost, we know how many VMs it runs on, we know how much storage it is. Okay? How much staff time is it? In York, we don't run a timesheeting service, or timesheeting process, so staff don't fill in a timesheet to say what pieces of work they're doing. So that was quite difficult for us to do. So we asked team leaders to say, in your team, how much time has Joe Blogg spent supporting whatever it might be? Quite a lot of margin for error in that one, obviously, because what tends to happen is that you remember the services that have just fallen over and you've spent a long time fixing, but not maybe things where you've done bits and pieces over a year or two, keeping them going. Then we attributed the staff costs across. Okay, as I said, difficult to do because no timesheets. And also we found out there were quite a lot of things that we did that actually didn't support the central service at all. There were things that we did for local areas. So just by asking that question, that was quite interesting. And we found out that some departments, for example, physics, which is where my husband works, so I can mention that very freely, actually demanded quite a lot of our time to help them with supporting their services. Okay, so I've told you all the wonderful things. Now here are the things that we then started to really struggle with. So we've done a big, broad brush for software license costs, but there's a lot more work to do, so we understand the major systems costs. We have we need to do some work on attributing data center costs, and this is one of the ones that I'd be very interested to have people's opinion on. There are a number of services that we have, for example, data center services, network services, and whatever, and we really struggle for how you would attribute that cost to a particular service. So, you know, if you've got your virtual learning environment or your student record system, how do you apportion a cost for the network for that, or the data center for that? Do you even bother? So that's one of the things that we've struggled with, and I'm not sure that there's an answer for. The thing that we want to do more of is power and cooling. So we're spending quite a lot of money on monitoring by rack and by server, actually putting monitoring in, so that we can actually say to run this service costs this amount of electricity. Or this amount of cooling. But that is a big job, and it requires quite a lot of investment in kit to do that. Track costs. I think TRAC stands for Transparent Approach to Costing. How transparent that actually is a very interesting question. Who here has anything to do with track costs in their institution? Okay. Do you think they're transparent? I'm very glad you said that, because that would be my view too. Track costs we really struggled with. We ended up doing a sort of broad brush approach to track costs. Not sure how you would do it more accurately. There is a whole methodology associated with track anyway, and I don't understand it and how it could be used appropriately for these sorts of things, but other people. Add in the depreciation of capital costs. As I've already mentioned, we struggled with that one because the institution struggled with it. So we've given a sort of guess around depreciation costs. There's more work to be done there. Covering the whole university, what I focused on for this exercise was just central IT services. If I was to be honest and say how much of IT is that across the university, it's maybe half. So we supply lots of services to students, for example, but a lot of our big science departments have teams of staff. A lot of our support departments, so for example our academic registry, also have IT staff who are working, and we've not included them in these costs. So there is a lot of cost. And one of the things when I first arrived I found scary actually was that the institution didn't actually know how many people were doing IT across the institution, or even to the finger in the air basis of how much cost that was if you added it up across the university. So that's something that we're slowly working through. We're taking it on department by department. At the moment we're working very closely with our computer science department. We've actually taken on the delivery of quite a lot of their services as part of a transition programme that we've got going. And we're looking in detail at the sorts of costs they still have left, because we've taken on a number of their services, but there's more to do. But I mean, that is another elephant that needs to be eaten bit by bit. Has anybody done this in their organisations? Does anybody? Wow. And how did you do it?
Basically, what invoices did you pay last year?
Sorry?
What invoices did you pay last year? That goes through to it.
So, but not staff costs? Including staff. So did you invoice them for, so you said?
Oh, we didn't do it across, we worked on the applications that we hosted. Right. And from that, across the university. We did the faculty computer basically.
I was just going to say, actually, the acoustics are not very good in this room, so if everybody could really project when you say anything, and maybe if you get a question, Heidi, if you could repeat it and say to the other speakers in the break. And if you could also say where you're from, if you're asking a question, it'd be nice, thank you.
Okay, so the question was, has anybody else, or has anybody managed to do costs across their whole institution? And this gentleman at the front here said yes.
We based it upon the invoices we paid last year at London Metropolitan University, and that included the applications that we hosted and the services we provided to other departments. And we added in the cost of our FTEs based on a figure of 50k per individual, and worked out which applications cost the most to us.
Okay. Sorry, there were other people. Does anybody else want to share what they did?
University of Oxford, we did at a very high level a couple of years ago now. What we did was spoke to central finance, got an understanding of the IT expenditure, and of course that's flawed because not every invoice is listed as IT. We looked at the capital and the revenue costs, so what we're spending on day-to-day versus the project stuff, and we rolled in the IT staff. Again, flawed because we don't know all the IT staff in the university, but that gave us a very high level view of what expenditure is.
And what was your split?
It's about half and half, and same staff.
Okay. Yeah, so this is definitely work in progress. We've done a lot of detailed work in central IT, but there's an awful lot more to do with the other sorts of IT going on in departments. One of the things my staff asked me when we started to do this process was, how on earth are we going to try and keep this up to date? Because it's all very well doing a one-off costing, But how are we going to do it? So what we've been looking at and have actually started to do is that when we're purchasing equipment, we're actually attributing it to a service. So if we buy more storage, we're trying to say this is storage for. Now, that, again, that doesn't always work, but at least we're trying to keep a record of equipment that we buy and how that maps onto a particular service. The hope is that once we've got this all fully sorted and tied down, keeping it up to date, because there is a big piece of work in the beginning, keeping it up to date should be relatively straightforward. But I think that remains to be seen, to be honest with you. I'm not sure that this will be a trivial exercise to keep things going. It needs to be part of the process. And obviously new things come on, change. What have we learnt by this? That it's really hard to do. I think that would be the first thing I would say. And we've been very pragmatic about what we've done, and it's still been hard. You know, we've sort of went, oh, well, all right, yes, we think that's about that amount, rather than trying to work it down to the very last pound, shilling and pence. I think the thing that we didn't have, and maybe you're in a different position, but we didn't have a very firm grasp of services at a detailed level and how they interrelated, what we were running. Maybe if you're much more organised, you would have that. We didn't. It took a long time to get to where we are. So it's about 18 months it's taken us to get this far, and it's been an iterative process. We forgot things, we didn't do things right. In fact, some of the costs I'm going to show you, and as Peter mentioned, the spreadsheet's being reworked because we got some things badly wrong in terms of what we'd added up, what we'd attributed, etc. So things do get missed out, and it isn't a straightforward exercise. The allocation of staff time without timesheets is flawed. How flawed it is, though, I actually don't know. I don't know whether it's 100% out, 50% out, or 10% out. If you ask individuals how they spend their time, they're not too bad at thinking of saying, but there is error in there. So you've got to decide whether or not that error is that important to you. So we used an iterative approach when we were doing this. So we went back to people and said, tell us how much this cost, tell us how much this cost. And this really drove people mad. So this is managers within my team. And that was partly because we were developing this model. You know, we didn't really know what to do. So we sort of tried something and then tried again. People lost patience with us over that one. So my advice would be to try and understand what your model is and then go out and get all those costs all in one go. Because doing it in one iteration would have been a better way of doing it, I think. Okay, challenges, and I've touched on this already. How do you allocate certain infrastructural costs to services where you absolutely need it? So there's, you know, you can't do anything without your network. And I mean, we're in the processes of extending our wireless network in particular massively. How does that, you know, how does that relate? How do you assign that to a service? So does the service, your student record service or your VLE service, have to scale with the amount of network or wireless access points? How do you do that? I think one of the surprises in this exercise for us was how much the network costs. I mean, it's a massive amount. I mean, storage and compute are nothing in comparison to the network costs. Absolutely nothing. And you should say, well, yes, of course you should have known that. But it wasn't until we started to add it up that we realised how expensive the network was, particularly with wireless extension, and particularly now that the network is used for building management systems, door locks, CCTV, etc., etc., etc. And how you allocate that across your services, or whether you should even try to allocate it across your services, was something that I don't have an answer to. And similarly, with costs like your data center, you know, they're sort of bits of thing that you need to have to run it all. How do you allocate it? So that was a biggie for us. In terms of figures, here's some of the figures that we came up with. So for our storage for a gigabyte per year, £2.33 for a gig. So not too bad, reasonable. So that includes all the things I've been talking about as far as you can. So staff cost, license cost, data center costs as we've tried to allocate them, etc. And then lower tiers of storage. We use something called Sunfire Thumper storage, as it's called in our place, about 31p for a gig. So an awful lot cheaper. So again there, it starts to get more interesting around decisions, putting things out in the cloud, for example. Does that make any sense for you to do some of these things? It is per year as a total cost of ownership cost. Wireless, very expensive. 340,000-ish a year when we add everything in. That's a lot of money, but then we've got a lot of wireless access points, a lot of network access points. Looking at things like administrative systems, does everybody know what Pure is? So a research information system. So what's interesting about that is the majority of the cost, or more than half, is the license cost for the software. The actual infrastructure stuff isn't that expensive. Identity management as a service, we reckon about £80,000 a year, so software license. Majority of that is actually staff cost, not license cost. SITS, our student record system. Again, the majority of that cost is not the infrastructural cost, it's the license costs. And obviously some staff cost in there. Finance system for those people in finance, that's cheaper than the student record record system by quite a step. And then our VLE, about 150k a year, which you can argue powerfully cheap for a service that provides that amount of value across the institution. And again, the majority of that cost there is licensing cost, not the infrastructural cost. And that's it. I want to thank my colleague, Stefan Weiglosch, who's our data center manager and has done a lot of the number crunching, and my colleague, Sarah Hall. We have an embedded accountant within IT services in York, and that's extremely useful. Although if Sarah was here, what she would say, so this was an exercise I initially gave to her to do, what she would say is she couldn't do this. It is not possible to do this from a purely financial perspective. She didn't understand when we started to talk about DNS, etc., what any of these things meant and how they linked together. And we actually realized that this was something that had to be led by an IT person, which is why we had the data center manager do it. He had a better understanding, go and talk to the right people, knew what kit was hosted in his space, etc., knew about power, networking, etc. So that was quite an interesting, you think this is a financial exercise? Not really at all. It's about understanding the services you deliver and how they fit together. So again, that was another interesting exercise. So if there are any accountants here in the room who are trying to do this on their own, you can't. Or not unless you are IT, as in IT specialists as well. Okay, I think that's me.
Yeah, I'll kick off. Rob Briscoe, JISC. Heidi, you said that network being very expensive, surprisingly, or even reassuringly expensive, I don't know. What actually costs there? Is it the kit, is it the people, or is it the energy and the licensing?
So it's mainly the kit. So it's getting, putting, however, we're about to double our number of wireless access points across the institution from 1,000 to 2,000. So it's the kit, but it's the wiring, it's the removal of the asbestos and all the lovely buildings that we have. Power's not a big issue for the networking side of things. Licensing, reasonable, but nothing like the software licenses for our business systems. And people, if you stacked it in the middle somewhere.
So that's for, you're talking about wireless there, but what about
for the whole thing?
The whole thing.
The whole thing.
Just to put a boss on what Heidi said about the network, when I saw the figures in your spreadsheet, Heidi, what struck me was that there were figures, and this is the advantage of having the data center manager involved, that he'd looked at all the historic purchase costs of the equipment, which wouldn't have been within the annual budget or anything like that. It was going back a number of years and actually checking off all the servers that were running. And I think from memory, the total purchase price of the servers in your data centre and supporting equipment was about £800,000. And the total purchase price of the networking equipment was, I think, about £1.5 million, wasn't it?
More, I think.
More. So twice as much as the metal within the data centre was the cost of the network. So it just puts that into proportion.
And quite a lot of that as well, there's a lot of sunk cost in there because of wiring.
Yeah.
Wiring costs a bloody fortune.
And so really, I think, to go back to your question about allocation, Heidi, the interesting thing I took really from the discussion around that was, if network is such a big item, does one need to start looking seriously at uses of the network and potentially charging the more intensive users or finding some way, of somehow affecting their behaviour? Now the problem is, I think, for you, a lot of the use is actually the students, isn't it, in residences and things like that, downloading videos and all that kind of thing, plus the heavy science things.
But no, it's getting the network out to those locations.
Yeah,
That's the difficult bit. The cost.
Sorry, one at the back first, and then we'll...
Mike Byron, University of Aberdeen. I was wondering how long it actually took you to do that first phase, that getting started phase, where you start to identify services running on the servers, mapping servers to services. What kind of time scale are you talking about? How many people in FTE did you actually have engaged in that activity?
Okay, so there was one individual who, so as I say, it started in the beginning as being an accountancy exercise, okay, so that was Sarah, okay, but then the data centre manager, Stefan, took that on, and I would have said it took him about 2 months to go through that exercise. Now, not working on that full time, but then, sort of going to talk to people saying, what's this, what's that. He knew what kit was in the data centre, but then talking to his colleagues. So a couple of months to get that list together. I mean, obviously, if you had one individual just working with people all the time, you could probably do it much quicker than that, so that was elapsed time. Actual time to take it, I don't think would take that long.
Steve Bowes, University of Partnership. I was just going back to the kind of infrastructural costs, such as the network, such as the data center. And it's something that we kind of mould over when we're doing our projects, apportioning power costs or power and cooling costs. And there's this argument, isn't there, against, well, if you're trying to apportion, first of all, you're thinking, well, there's a fixed cost that I've got, perhaps to the network, and then there's a marginal cost that this particular service is using over and above the fixed cost. And that seems relatively straightforward, but then you start to think, well, hold on a second, we need a network anyway.
That's why I'm saying it gets
so is
really
my fixed
difficult.
cost really a sunk cost? Because
Yeah, it's an infrastructural cost. You need a building, you need,
you need
it's...
identity management, you need DNS, you need printers, there's a certain set of services that need that network regardless. So it's only, so if you take the decision to not apportion the fixed costs, the sunk costs, if you like, and only apportion the marginal costs, it ends up being quite subjective.
It does.
And every institution may take a different view on that. So that's really interesting about that model, because that needs to be kind of, we can tell you what we did, but you may have a different view.
Well, there is an accountancy perspective on this, I think. Do you want to give
There's
that one?
accountants in the room, but just mind there, it really depends why you're asking the question. And there can be a number of different things you can do with all of this. If you're charging out for services, then that would probably suggest that you need to bring in everything that you've paid in the past, because ultimately that needs to be recovered. A lot of ifs and buts there, but broadly speaking. If you're saying, well, we've got a network come what may, and it's a sunk cost and it will never ever change, then it doesn't really matter how much it cost, it's spent. But that's unlikely. It may be likely in the short term it's not going to change much, but will it never change depending on extra demands made of it? And if you start adding in CCTV and what was it, building management system, students downloading videos, extra, and then they go on to okay, you get the idea. There are going to be extra loads on it, and the numbers coming out of this spreadsheet won't be directly the ones that will immediately be relevant for making those decisions. But you've got the database there that you can mine. It's got it all there, and you can ask those what-if questions, and you're in a lot more powerful position than if you're just approaching it with a blank sheet of paper each time.
So there's a danger in there that if you do load up your service costs with that inside cost, that it's always going to look bad if you compare it then with the cloud. And in that paradigm change of moving from services are in your own data center to services in a hybrid or full cloud infrastructure, you're going to get the costing wrong, because you're still going to end up with your high cost data center. And now you've got services out in the cloud as well.
I couldn't agree more. Basically, a sunk cost will be irrelevant there, without getting too much into the accounting textbooks. If you're making a decision going forward, then it's only what's going to happen in the future that's relevant. You can't decide what's already happened. Yeah, write it off. And in the short term, there might not be a lot of impact on a lot of those infrastructure costs. In the longer term, that's less likely, and you tend to see those fixed costs creeping up over time. But unless you've got this sort of model that tries to track down what's causing the demands on those resources, then you haven't really got any way of understanding what's the cost drivers in the job.
Actually, I didn't mean to suggest that you were the only accountant in the room, Martin. We're very pleased that we have got so many people from finance here. So if you do want to chip in on any of these points, please do so. There's a gentleman here I saw first. We'll get around to everybody.
Yeah, so the bit you discover your network. This is John Butter on King's IT. So you discover how much your network costs. So that's a bit scary, but it's also good to let your finance director know about that. So we've actually done that at King's. So tracking out some of our service stats, we see the network was giving us a lot of issues. So it's helping the senior community understand actually this thing really matters. If they wanted to keep working, they've got to keep investing in it, and unless you've got alternative ways to provide that service.
Well, one of the things that we did was to say, this is how much sunk cost we've got in the network now, and that surprised people hugely of how much money because you build up over, another building comes online, you do more in a building. Actually saying, this is how much investment we've got, so therefore for recurrent costs or for capital replacement costs, you need to take that into account. You can't just think it will, you've done it once and you never need to do it again, which is a bit of the view in some of these things, particularly things like wiring, where you run out of wiring much quicker than you think you would, 10, 15 years sometimes. Anyway, sorry.
There's a couple of other hands up actually, so yeah. Danny?
It's Danny Brown from the University of London. Just a quick comment from me. From a commercial perspective, if you don't take into account the sunk cost everything on the margin, eventually you will end up losing money if you have to sell a service. It's as simple as that. You can't ignore sunk costs.
I guess the key issue in practice is whether you're going to have to do any kind of replacement or new investment during the lifetime of the decision you're looking at. If you're not, it doesn't really matter. But if you are, then you need to take that into account. So, do you have any comment on that? Yeah.
I'm Frank Lister at Imperial College. I just had a question really about the way you were classifying services. So, can you tell us a little bit more, like, did you have hierarchies of services?
Yes.
Or did you have groupings of services? Because how did you sort of go about classifying that aspect?
Well, in the first instance, we just wrote down what services we thought we had, so at a basic level. And then we tried to group them into network services, compute services, storage services. Because if you think about it, if you look at your virtual learning environment, you're going to have a proportion of all of those to run that. So in some ways, we did it in standard computing terms. It's got a server to run on. What did that cost? What storage does it need? What compute power does it need? So it was in a way sort of the tiers that you would find when doing a computing service. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I think I just put a gloss on that. We looked at Imperial in the first stage of the project with Janet, and I think your service catalogue came to 412. In York, you came up with 105.
Yeah.
The Janet X-ray tool has grouped them all into about 35 to 40.
Depends on your level of granularity. It really does, and what you want. what you want to group together, how you want to do this. And also, some things, if they're a tiny weeny proportion of cost, are you that interested in it? So there is a Pareto involved in some of this. Does that actually matter? Whereas if it's a very large cost, you obviously want the detail of it. So there is a sort of a bit of common sense.
When you were reporting the results in service terms, did you start to simplify it down?
Yeah, well, like I've shown you there. So, how much does it cost to run the VLE?
And that was the approach of the Janet model. They've crunched it down to.
But I think we did the costs at a more detailed level than.
But I think the other interesting point that struck me, Heidi, as I've looked at your work, is, as you say, you've obviously come at it in a way from the IT side.
Yeah.
And what does it cost? But the interesting linkage, in a way, particularly if you move into a charging environment, is who is the customer for those services, and actually starting to find your service catalogue around customers rather than using that as the basis of grouping.
Well, you have to do two things. That's what I'm saying. So when I looked at we know in terms of, or if you think of our customers on our website, we've got the services that we offer to them. That's relatively straightforward. But all the services that you need to deliver those services, so your technical service catalogue in a way, is where you need to understand the costs more. And then you need to aggregate those up into the services that you're going to deliver, which is where these apportionment things come in. How do you apportion that in? What is sunk, what's not sunk?
Hi, I'm Kenton Wheeler from Southampton Solent University. How do you apportion the cost of implementing a new service that you'd implemented maybe a year ago? So all the project costs, implementation, consultancy, that kind of.
We didn't. So we looked at. Yes and no. So we obviously we knew if you'd bought licenses for that, we'd know that you'd bought licenses for it. We knew if staff were spending time on it because we asked about staff. Infrastructure, if we bought infrastructure, but even if not, we did know. So say you think about Pure, our research information system, we would say, well, Pure's using this amount of storage, this amount of virtual machine. So we did it from that angle. We didn't do it as a project, so we weren't looking at project costing.
The running costs of that service as opposed to
the implementation cost, yes.
That was put together to create that service in the first place.
I think that's a different exercise. I think there's an implementation cost of a project and then a business as usual type of cost.
So you tend to look at those differently.
And what about capital investment in the future? So the network, you're going to spend, £500,000 refreshing all your switches or routers. How did you apportion that? Did you include that for the next X years in your cost estimates?
No. So we know how much we've got and how much we need to do to replace, but we didn't include that in the cost. You mean if sort of forward-looking, saying you're going to need? Yeah.
So
well, I suppose depreciation.
To run wireless, you're going to need to replace the APs every 3 years, 4 years, or whatever.
No, we didn't do that. But obviously, that's a huge cost. It's what I'm making my bid for more capital based on.
So, sorry, Gary and I, Bedfordshire. Presumably, those were annual costs you put up there.
Yep.
So, for example, for the Wi-Fi, I think it was 330,000. Did that include depreciation on the capital investment you had made previously?
Yes. So it does. So in some ways, it does cover it if you think about it.
I wondered if you had any idea of what proportion of those costs were depreciation as opposed to annual license costs.
No, it depends on how over what period of time you write it off over.
Well, it was about 1.8 million or something, wasn't it? So if it was 5 years, then so 300,000 slightly over.
Yes.
Neil Brindley, GIS. So you said one of your motivations for doing this was to offer services to others, and you've got 50% of the university who are doing their own thing. So
maybe,
yeah. Presumably they've got their own storage, and perhaps some of them are doing some calculations of their own. I don't know, but so your storage per gigabyte per year is you've got these figures. So do you have a sense yet, or do you think you might want to get a sense of if you worked at larger scales that possibly presumably come down, or what other parameters might affect that? gigabyte per year cost?
So first of all, to say that, as I said at the beginning, one of the challenges I've been set by my institution is to centralise more of the commodity type services for IT. So obviously storage would be one of them. So obviously, yes, the argument I'm making is that economies of scale will be, if I'm buying, 500 terabytes of storage, I'm likely to get it at a cheaper price than you going out for 10 terabytes. So absolutely, I can aggregate demand. Secondly, I've tried, in fact, Peter's tried, to get costs for some of these services out of departments, and they didn't want to tell me. Now, it's quite interesting, this. So I'm married to an academic, a professor of physics, actually, and I have said to him, do not buy these services for your group. Let me offer these services to you as from Central IT Services. And it caused quite a lot of marital dispute, actually. I'm not sure I'd recommend that as a way forward.
That's a lesson learned.
Oh, it's a definite lesson learned. But what we discovered in that process of negotiation was that the level of service that Central IT wanted to offer the physics department in terms of its security backup, the cost of the equipment we would do. I can buy this for £5 from PC World. Why does it cost you 500 to provide this for me? We really got into some quite nitty-gritty arguments around that one. And I think that's one of the main difficulties with offering services to science departments or other areas, that what Central IT would do, so basic things like I would say, well, this machine needs to have a dual power supply and it'll cost more. Why do you need a dual power supply? Well, because if one fails, love, the other one might need to. Anyway, I won't go into the detail. The definition of what we provide in Central IT is often much higher spec than academics think they need. Now, the other side of that is that if I offer a service to an academic department and it fails, they're on the phone within about 20 seconds. If they provide the service themselves and it fails, they're much more tolerant of failure. And so there's a real difficulty there, a real difficult conundrum to be worked out around what is good enough to offer. Because I think sometimes we do gild the lily. I think we do offer services which are extremely high spec, and maybe, in fact, we've been investigating cheap storage, cheap and cheerful, just works, only backed up to tape or whatever, versus what we will often do is gold plate it. So that one. But also this negotiation around service level, around if it's offered in department, there's a tolerance for less of a service than if it comes from a central provision. So that's slightly off topic for this argument, but point of notice. At the back.
Yeah, Mike Barrett, University of Aberdeen. I think you're really kind of touching for me on what's the interesting nub of the problem here. If the colleges providing themselves, you say that we're tolerant, I think it's because the cost is lower, therefore the expectation is lower. I'm not sure it's that they actually offer it themselves. I think it's maybe cost related.
Is it not controlled?
Do you now keep a record against failures and risk versus cost and service? Because it helps answer that question in terms of whether we're massively overspecking machines. We put it in redundant power supplies and things, but how often do we need them? And I think that's where we can take that next step, how we actually balance these things out and work out
Well, we're actually having that debate internally about, what do we actually need to provide, as in what's necessary, what's needed, as opposed to what we think as IT professionals is required and what we would normally do. So we haven't got there yet. We're definitely looking at providing cheaper than we would do, cheaper and a lower level of service. But it's getting that message across. And I'm not convinced it's the fact that it's cheaper, therefore they're more tolerant. I think it's to do with loss of control and trust, much more so. That, if it breaks yourself, you can ring somebody up poke somebody out of bed or whatever it is.
It's more than the analogy that I go to BMW and I spend £50,000 on a car and it breaks in a week. I'm less worried than if I've spent £500 on my car. So I expect my car to get me to work. But if I'm paying BMW 50,000, I've got different expectations than paying my local garage 500. That's why I wonder if there's a cost component in there.
But I also think there's a lack of appreciation. You know, the storage, you know, the USB stick or the terabyte drive I can buy from PC World is not comparing apples with apples. It's not, you know.
What do you think of them? Is my life chance of losing it any greater than yours? Again, it's an interesting question to have.
Well, it is an interesting question to have. Yeah, it is an interesting debate to have.
Helping us take that journey, helping to have those good discussions.
Good luck.
You're not married to anybody in...
That's customer, isn't it?
Curtis Background, University of Arts, London. I'm just wondering, at what level did these performance indicators go up in your organisation? Was it at the finance, at the IT sort of decision-making, or were you doing it higher up? The measures you've got out of
The figures. They've been used by central IT for looking at where our costs are spent, but they've also been used to provide information to senior management with budget setting of, you know, this is how much I need to provide the service. So they've gone up as well as across.
Do you have another question, Rob?
Yeah, I touched on it before, but I think there's a really, and I think this will resonate, certainly my time working in an institution, being one of those annoying people. Sorry, that went and bought services because I felt central IT didn't. John was supposed to work with John at Bristol, nodding his head in recognition. I think it's that central-local tension which you talked about before, and I wonder if you've got any thoughts in the room on how you go about actually changing the mindset within the institution on that.
Well, I'll answer it from the York point of view. So what I am trying to do is give services away for free. So to be given enough money centrally to provide services for people so they don't have to buy their own. That means I've got to squeeze the price of what I deliver. So it means I've got to get it to be as cost effective and as fit for purpose as possible. The model that York used to have was that it charged people basically for blowing their nose. I mean, everything we did we charged for, which was an enormous bureaucracy, and all that happened was people went out and did it themselves. So we've reversed that model and are now trying to say, we'll do it for you. And if you're doing it for them, as I say, you've got to get your own cost down because you can't do it. But you then get rid of that whole argument around whether it's cheaper to do it in-house or in department or not. So that's my approach. That's what I'm trying to do.
I think another point there is, you know, to distinguish between kind of commodity services and value-added services. And I think, you know, in your case where you brought them in, they've been commodity services, you know, where at the end of the day there's no great mileage in operating your own email system or whatever, compared with centralising that. Whereas in science particularly, when there's a kind of a magic in the programming or whatever else it may be, or it's very critical to experiments.
Well, there's differences, absolutely. But storage, desktop, compute, they are commodity services now.
So Nigel Rance and Rob Holloway, I agree with you. I'd like to be able to provide services and outcomes to the end user. I just wonder, and I'm quite excited obviously, but a good question. What does your sustainability model look like for research data? Because storage is a commodity, and my God, they consume a lot of it, and they're going to need to keep it for longer and longer. What does your financial model look like for sustaining the growth of research?
We don't have one. We don't. I mean, and anybody who does, I'd be very interesting to speak to. I don't know how you model that one.
So at some point, that storage that you're buying.
And are you talking about archived storage here, or are you talking about active storage? Because this is where it starts to active. Yeah.
So I mean, at some point, you're going to run out, aren't you?
Yep. Yeah. So what I'm trying to do is get a sustainable funding stream. Now I'm banking on the fact that storage is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, like everybody else is. But I don't know anybody. I mean, I know, is there somebody from Bristol here? Because you've spent a lot of money, haven't you, on Edinburgh and Bristol and somewhere else. You've spent a lot of money on buying storage and giving it away to academics for the RDM type of activity. But I didn't think you had a sustainable model either, do you?
It depends which spreadsheet you look at.
All right.
Can I ask you something there? John Richards, University of Bristol. One interest I have is talking about giving services away for free, is that the trouble is that the users think they are free. And I would like to find a way of shutting things down more efficiently.
You mean getting rid of data?
These legacy services that just keep going forever and ever and ever. And I want to be able to point to them and say, do you know how much it costs us to keep that going? Have you had any luck in that?
Well, I mean, just knowing that we've got all of these, when I was saying there was lots of gaps in terms of, well, we've got this box running and what runs it. Oh, Lord, that's that thing there. You know, just standard identification. And we have had a number of occasions where we've gone back to people and said, look, we've got this for you. It hasn't been touched for the last 5 years. Can we get rid of it? And they're, oh, yeah, that's fine. Oh, yeah, of course you can. So, I mean, I think just identifying it. But again, having this life cycle of do you still need it? Do you still need it? We've just taken on a lot of data from two departments, electronics and comp sci, and there's terabytes of the stuff. And I'm pretty sure that most of it hasn't been looked at for a long time. My argument to my staff was, can't you get them to throw it away, or some of it away? And the argument back was, we can't offer to take on the service and make them throw things away beforehand. So I don't have an answer to that one. But research data management might help with that.
Right, Andrew Lee, University of Bath. We have a hybrid model for the research storage approach, whereby centrally I provide 1 terabyte per project per PA and 1 terabyte per PI, and 1 terabyte free per PI for those who do social sciences and can't get any real money. That they get for free.
Yep.
And then they have to buy any additional that they want, and they buy that at the rate of how much it's going to cost me now for 13 years. So that's how much they get. They get 13 years worth of how much it costs now.
And why 13 years?
4 years
the grant and 10 years of, yeah.
And that seems to more or less work because I do allow them to cheat. And if they have 2 or more projects, one of which doesn't take up its full terabyte, they can still use the terabyte allocated to the project, the little project. So broadly it works.
Good. I shall have to come and visit you.
Steve first, and then you.
Yes, Steve Oakland, University of Hertfordshire again. Just related to previous conversation over there, that isn't there a complementary model to the one that you've put together, in that you found out what the cost of delivering services is, but what is the cost of not delivering service? Because I come from before I went to work in university, I come from the corporate world, and in support of IT, there was always a business manager who could tell me, what the cost of his application, his service, not running was. And I just wondered whether we ever do that within the university, because, justifying...
So the opportunity cost, basically. How would you do that, though? How would you cost how much it costs not to do this? I don't know.
Well, if we knew the answer to that,
If we
the question of whether we need to keep something running just because it's there.
I see what you mean. Are you talking? But I think the question there was more around storing a big pot of data. Was that more what the question was?
Well, there's 2 different questions, aren't there? But you have to talk to those business managers and get back to us, Stephen, how they did it.
After you did this costing exercise, has it changed the way you've provided any of those services?
Well, the big switch is that we don't charge for them, actually. So the change I'm trying to get is and I've had a degree of success in this, of saying to University Central, I need this amount of money to provide this service for free. If you give me that amount of money, people take up the service. They don't go off and do it themselves. So I suppose that's the biggest switch. It's made us much more aware. I mean, it really has made us much more aware and able to provide better arguments.
Is there a nervousness, though, of kind of quantifying some of these things? Because there's a school of thought that if you don't tell people how much it costs, then they won't challenge it.
Actually, the nervousness, I think a lot of it, what we've found is that we're dead cheap actually, and that when you start to look at what it would cost you to do it commercially, we are extremely good value. And so in some ways it's been the opposite way around.
It would be very interesting to see a number of different universities and the costs of providing the same services, because then you could get an angle as to where you are in the pecking order of how much does it cost you to provide entity management over someone up the road.
Well, that's the aim of the JANA costing tool, of course, to provide those comparisons. Anyone here use that tool? You were from? Oxford.
We did it across the centre, so rather than the whole university. I understand most of the other people that have taken part done it across the whole organisation. But we found it very useful. If you were to ask the same question to us, it's too early to say. We are beginning to have discussions with our stakeholders about the shape of our service catalogue. What do they really think we should be delivering? We know things we didn't know before, that there are 18 of our services that use up 50% of our money and our staff time. So presumably there are opportunities for savings made there that we done elsewhere. We know we're probably investing too much in big admin systems and not enough in research systems, as we were talking about at the lunch. So I think it allows you to begin that conversation with your partners in the wider university. And I would always favour transparency over trying to hide the costs, because they already think they're hiding the costs. You go to them and show what you've got and explain maybe thought that this is as good as we can get. They do engage quite well.
So Heidi, one of the things you set out to do was understand where the money was going. Did you health check all of those assumptions and estimates you made? Do the figures actually add up?
Well, as I say, the big surprise for me, well, the number of big surprises: one, how much the network cost, I've already said that, but two, when you're talking about delivering admin systems in particular, the infrastructure's fiddling in comparison to the license costs. You know, the real bit, you know, we all accept these massive license costs that go up by however much % every year for our admin systems. And yet there's in my institution had been very little focus on that. It was like paying the mortgage. You paid your SITS or Aggresso license or whatever. The focus had been more on the sort of storage infrastructure or a compute infrastructure, whereas actually it should be the other way around. We should be squeezing on the license cost more. And I read something somewhere actually on one of those, you know, CIO discussion forums around what were the things most likely. So they'd done a survey of what were the things most likely to push budgets out, and license costs was it. And that absolutely fits with my experience. You know, license for using VMware, or I mean, has anybody got cut out by the Red Hat one recently, where they won't allow you to use the academic license anymore for your bloody VLE? You've got to pay the... Anyway, I won't get me started. But those... So yes, so those are the sorts of things that were a surprise when you actually added it up, where the costs go. And this sort of Pareto in terms of effort of how much should I focus on that and how much should I focus on this has been very useful. Not that I've got a cheaper license cost for SITS or my VLE because of that.
I understand that, it's great to hear that. So, did you, I mean, you've estimated all these things, but have you compared that back to what you spent over the last 5 years and see?
Well, the costs were based on the past 5 years. That's how we got it. I mean, some poor bugger went through and looked at everything we'd spent. So,
very comprehensive, you'll see when it comes around. I think that there's another aspect of it, I think, from our conversations, Heidi, that you know, you found quite interesting, and I found quite interesting, and that was the scale of the difference on storage between the different tiers, and how expensive the Tier 1 NetApp was, you know, compared with the rest. And so that raised the question of, you know, irrespective of kind of what you do with those costs, you know, does all the data that's been stored at that Tier 1
need to be
there?
And the answer is most definitely no.
That's right. And so I think that comes to a more general point here around costing. When we had the morning session, we talked about a little bit around a sort of two-step process in a way of, first of all, developing a kind of a strategic cost model, as it were. You haven't really got figures in, but you're just trying to think through what are the key cost items relevant to whatever you're trying to deal with, in particular a decision, let's say, about storage. And then, of course, what you then do is try and populate it with the data. But you've got a template that you're working to that's saying, these are the important issues, we need to find the data on this. And even if you can't find the data, at least you can obviously it's the signal that that's the case. But I think part of that strategic cost model is actually saying, well, can we avoid just simply making a decision where we take the user demands as given, or whatever else, whatever else is driving the decision? That we're just about providing a technical solution to a problem defined as we need to store X amount of data over the next 20 years, and we need to store it, unless anything changes, in this way, when it's going to be at tier 1. And so the point is, every investment decision, significant investment decision, is also an opportunity to look at the way the system is configured and to ask the questions, obviously, could it be reconfigured differently? So if you're invested in storage, could you accompany that with a storage policy that is much more clearly, asking people to specify what the life is, what level it can be stored at, etc.
Instead of making an assumption that it has to be.
And how many 14 years or whatever else it may be, there is a decision point that says, okay, we've reached this point, is it still necessary? And so, although it's like a double discussion this, at one level we're going down to the details of finance, but at the other level, you've always got to pull back and couple that with these more strategic kind of questions and discussions. And I think that also speaks, say, to the science point, the local kit and the science departments. It's not just finance, it's obviously about things like risk and things like that, because they may not be operating to the same standards of backup or archiving or things like that the central IT department is. Anyway, we've had a sterling discussion, and Heidi's done a fantastic job, as ever. Thank you again, Heidi, for such a fantastic presentation, and more later.